Can the formal principles of painting model a new society? This question drove Kandinsky's non-representational work between 1908 and 1913, which my thesis explores by looking at non-representation in both art and politics. Kandinsky found inspiration for non-objective painting in Peter Kropotkin's anarchism, which advocated a society based on mutual aid, free association of individuals, and also the total absence of government. Kropotkin believed that moral principles like equality and altruism were common to all, and, if left uninterrupted, could naturally give rise to a society that ensured the greatest degree of individual happiness. Both figures believed the path towards a better society began with getting rid of organizational limits to freedom. This meant protesting the status quo and eliminating representation in art and politics alike. They sought something more immediate and authentic than representation in the form of capitalism, of government, or even language to serve as the foundation for society's structure. But Kandinsky and Kropotkin rely on ahistorical and universal notions of individuality and individual freedom as a result. They attempt to mitigate the problem that individuality really poses to the organically emerging society they envision by positing the individual as an abstract entity, something part of a universal human nature. But these totalizing notions only really rhetorically mitigate the problem individuality really poses. Their respective non-representational projects fail to reconcile a general notion of the individual with the actual particularity of individuality itself, and also fail to provide a framework for collaboration and communication between individuals that could give rise to the social change they desired. We can see in Kandinsky's non-objective painting Composition 5 how non-representation attempts to mitigate differences between people by integrating individuality into an overarching social whole. There's an intense contrast of bright and dark colors, and a discordant use of black lines that oscillate in thickness across the canvas, and together create a disharmony that compels us as viewers to make our own connections between forms within the image. But we remain in some way still united by the fact that our individual experiences of the canvas correspond to the same material work, to the same individual's artistic expression. Abstract painting in this way sort of becomes a fantastical, immediate form of mediation between people, a form that is not alienating, a social platform that still retains individual freedom. But in the disjointed presence of the figure that appears in various forms across the image, we can also see how Kandinsky's desire to model the immediacy and openness of subjective experience as the basis for a better society is really complicated by his reliance on the individual as an abstract entity. The figure represents Kandinsky's view of the individual as defined and connected to others by what he himself referred to as an abstract spirit, common to all, rather than by definite particular experiences of individual existence. The explosion of the figure here foregrounds a kind of abstract cosmic unity as the basis for human connection, rather than immediately legible and personal framework of association. He therefore leaves no real material or substantive basis for collaboration necessary for translating subjective experience into the social change he wanted. Despite the universalizing tendencies that occur in Kandinsky's equation of non-representation with individual freedom, he still probes the problem of individual freedom in really productive ways. His aesthetic project of abstraction attempted to reconcile individual freedom with the social model, and it therefore serves as an example of how artistic expression can be a valuable tool for exploring alternative foundations for social relationships and for community that the structure of society either oppresses or altogether fails to articulate. The complex relationship between freedom and structure is still extremely prevalent, perhaps now more than ever as we face a global pandemic. Amidst the ebb and flow of restrictions and social responsibilities, we are forced every day to consider our role, function, and freedom as individuals in relation to the social whole. What is more, the pandemic has occasioned a real opportunity for exploring and questioning, as Kandinsky did, the kind of society we want to be. Scholars since the 1930s have considered Kandinsky's work too subjective, as too individualistic or escapist to have a real impact on society. They have ignored the social aspect of Kandinsky's work, which, I argue, should not be so easily dismissed.
I was lucky enough to have the chance to study Larissa Sansour for my thesis, which I lengthily titled Larissa Sansour, Ecologies, Worlding, and an Ethic of Care for the Apocalypse. Born in Jerusalem in 1973, Sansour is now based in London and makes work that centers the situation of Palestine and Israel. Today, we can see that Israel, as a settler colonial nation state, produces and upholds its power through westernized spatial and temporal logics, which separate, displace, and eliminate the indigenous Palestinian population. Larissa Sansour, as a displaced Palestinian artist, takes up these conditions and creates a new imaginary, at times intervening in the logics of Zionism, at times making her own worlds entirely. In doing so, she not only reveals the mechanisms behind Zionist Israel, but also produces a new ecology that overhauls the settler colonial environmentalist relation to land, people, and the non-human. She thus demands an indigenous and ecofeminist outlook, which takes caring for all kinds of others as its point of departure. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll look at two of her most recent works, both of which are short films, to identify her call for new structures of kinship, agency, and care in a world on the brink of a colonially driven environmental disaster. The first is In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain. It was the 2015 addition to Sansour's so-called sci-fi trilogy, and it expounded upon and voiced the inherent problem of nationalism, showing the instrumentalization of archaeology to produce a nation and history itself, and the power dynamics that determine who gets to produce and shape historical narratives. In the Future, a protagonist who calls herself a narrative terrorist details a traumatic history of losing her sister to the quote-unquote rulers of her land, explaining her plans to lead a narrative resistance group which will create and implant artifacts of an invented civilization to be excavated by future archaeologists. Her character seeks this plan not only to avenge her sister's death, but also to expose history, archaeology, and nations as produced, unnatural, and inherently political. This prompts viewers to consider how such tactics have been used to determine histories on Earth, and to realize the fictive workings of historical narrative. Sansour's film also flips the script on Israel's relation to the Earth, ritualistically giving to the land rather than mining it for data. Her new world envisions a futurity built on a new spatialization, one that moves into science fiction geographies and architecture, as well as a new temporality, one not restricted by Western linear narrativity, which the title itself demonstrates. Sansour's most recent work, a split-screen film in Arabic with English subtitles called In Vitro, was made in 2019. It follows a woman, Dunya, as she attempts to rebuild life after a rapture-like eco-disaster. The result is a pseudo-Eden in which she grows not just plants, but a human as well, a clone of her daughter lost in the apocalypse. Life itself is thus sustained after the end of the world by the entangled growth of human and non-human, a line which blurs past recognition. For life to continue, in Donna Haraway's words, companion species must engage in relentless processes of becoming with a world in which natures, cultures, subjects, and objects do not pre-exist their intertwined worldings. Ecologically, In Vitro confronts a world in which the words life, human, and earth do not exist as viewers know them. Sansour demands that we reconsider our own vocabulary and methods for collectivity and care, reminding us of our own impending ecological apocalypse and the apocalypses already wrought by colonialism. Sansour's science fiction film, and her art in general, is thus a way out of this limited vocabulary, a way of speaking with vision, care, and challenge. She evokes the work of ecofeminists like Jane Bennett and Donna Haraway, and Indigenous scholars like Winona LaDuke, reminding us that, in LaDuke's words, Indigenous ways of living are the only sustainable ways of living. Not only must all matter be cared for as kin, Indigenous ecologies that uphold this care are the only way forward, as the Earth faces continued degradation at the hands of settler environmentalism. This ethic of care, articulated through Larissa Sansour's varied works, is how we have a future after the end of the world. Thanks so much.
Hi again. Um, Alexis, I really enjoyed that. I don't have a question for you. I just want to encourage you to take a look at Tara Numedal's new book, Anna Zieglerine and the Lion's Blood, which is a true medieval German story of the woman that you just described. um,
Wow, that sounds amazing. Thank you.
it's really good. She teaches in the history department. But Quinn, I did have a question for you. It was one, I was one of the readers of Quinn's thesis, but I had a question then, and I wonder if you were able to think about this. You use non-representation and abstraction in your presentation a little bit interchangeably, but in your thesis, you seem to make a distinction between those two words, and it seemed meaningful. You know, the word non-representation that Kandinsky, you seemed to be his mission in a way, and I wondered what that was for Kropotkin, because you said it was something the two of them shared, and I couldn't figure out exactly what non-representation was for Kropotkin, but it did seem to end up being abstraction for Kandinsky, and yet abstraction turned into, in the explanation I understood, an art. It was a co-option in a way of the aggressive non-representation, the push against representation that I understood Kandinsky to be in search of. And tell me that I'm wrong.
No, I think that's right. I actually struggled for a long time before I started writing with how non-representation specifically manifests in Kropotkin, and I mean it's pretty actually simple. It's just what he means is no government. So it's at once anti-representative government, but also just the total absence of government and sort of nothing, no overarching structure that is there to represent and own and enact and own a single individual's interests and needs, if that makes sense. And then in terms of Kandinsky, I sort of come to use the word abstraction just because of its popular usage now. But Kandinsky was leery of using that word because he really wanted to get away from the reality, from the world, from the empirical world. And abstraction sort of had a connotation of just still taking away from the world in which people existed. And instead he would use non-representational or non-objective, because that was more sort of referential to what his works themselves were depicting, which came from within the individual and not from anywhere else, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question?
Yes, that totally cleared it up. Thank you so much. Thank you both.
Okay, our second question comes from Holly Schaefer.
Hello, thank you so much for those wonderful presentations. In both of your projects, utopia and dystopia are tied together. And so I just wanted to ask you more about this. How are these two things, binaries, seeming opposites, actually potentially feeding each other?
Really, that's a great question. Quinn, do you want to go first, or?
You can go.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, because for Sansour, they're very related, partly because her main medium is science fiction, which I think deals very well in kind of moving past this binary of what's a utopia versus a dystopia. And I mean, you can think very traditionally of like the Thomas More utopia is nowhere, and that in many ways Sansour creates these worlds that are genuinely dystopias to reveal the dystopias that we live in as of now, but to sort of create space to imagine worlds much better than what we exist in or what are depicted on screen for the future. And in doing so, kind of changes these temporal spaces, makes these nowheres that seem familiar but aren't, but allow us to kind of consider beyond kind of ideal versus not ideal, which is very different, I think, than how Quinn's project deals with it, which is really fun. So maybe she wants to say a bit about that too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question. And just, I guess the two ideas of utopia and dystopia both provide like a conceptual framework for looking at alternative ways of living and alternative societies. And I think that plays into sort of an activist project in art a lot of the times. And the interesting thing with Kandinsky is while he saw his work as envisioning like an ideal society and precipitating that society by like working through individuals, a lot of people after World War I, and specifically the Marxist scholars during the 1930s, saw his work as super chaotic and attributed it to like the rise of fascism, which in itself kind of gives a dystopian element to his work. And so I think that question just brings about an interesting point where there's a very fine line between like utopian and dystopian, and it really depends on who's looking at what who's looking at the work, I guess.
Great, thank you both.
So I actually have a question. Alexis, this is a question I've been meaning to ask you all year, and suddenly I have a moment to ask it, so I'm going to ask it. And my question is about, it has to do with the anticipatory archaeology in Sansour's project, this idea of burying things and anticipating that they will be excavated again. You didn't talk about that too much in your presentation tonight, but I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the role that plays in her work.
Thank you so much for asking that. Yeah, unfortunately 5 minutes, you really can't cover that much, but yeah, that's, I mean, so much of her project. She has a lot of exterior or kind of auxiliary works that she does, revisionist construction or industrial line, which I showed a picture of, where she's like literally printing kuffaya on plates that are then used in her project, both for the movie, but also for a project that she did alongside that called Archaeology in Absentia, where she literally did performance art, buried the kuffaya printed plates in various places, and then actually inscribed the coordinates on these old bomb shells, which is why in the video you'll see these kind of vintagey bomb shells falling and breaking apart and holding this pottery. But yeah, she sort of twists this timeline by showing both that we construct our own narratives of civilizations, showing that we produce narratives by writing our own histories that sort of pick and choose. And this connects to what Ivy was talking about too, and hers, and Olivia too, of that we're literally constructing our own authenticities and constructing our own narratives as we speak. But she also engages in this sort of reverse archaeology in a really interesting way of showing that we can construct our own worlds in present time that don't necessarily align with our current modes of temporality. So we can actually live in different temporal modes even within the world that we exist in now, which is so determined by, I mean, what you could consider very hegemonic discourse of Western linear narrativity, or yeah, so all these ways of sort of breaking out of these binaries, which is connected to Professor Schaefer's question too. But yeah, I'm happy I can go on more about that, but I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you.
It's fascinating, the idea of the possibility of living in multiple temporalities, or thinking about a sort of future that would be articulated through
Right.
that kind of vocabulary.
Mm-hmm. And such a poetics too. I mean, even just her title, In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain, just living in a poetic sensibility as opposed to prosaic. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop. But thank you.
Thank you. We have another question from Ito.
I actually think that your question, Jeff, in part sort of asked the question I wanted to ask, but maybe I'll ask it anyway. And this is for Alexis, and she can address it in a slightly different form, which is, I also have been wanting to ask all along throughout the semester about, and you laugh, but about Sansour's media, right? So she's a multimedia artist. And I wanted to ask you to speak about the moments and the ways in which she uses different media. Primarily, you've dealt with her film, right? And I don't know if this is a sort of, something that has to do with the trajectory of her career, where she's used different media in different, phases of her career, or if she uses media, I think you alluded to it just a few minutes ago, about performance, about printing the keffiyeh on, on plates and so on, but just the choice of media and also the materiality of certain media versus other media, and how that all comes together in her work.
That's such a wonderful question. Thank you so much. Yeah, because I think it's really easy to tie sculpture to materiality. That seems like such a one-to-one ratio. So in some ways, it's even more radical that she's using this very intangible CGI virtual reality world to discuss materiality. But she spans a lot of different mediums. Film is definitely her primary medium, but she does sculpture, she does performance art. And she also she's a writer, but a lot of the writing comes from, she works often in partnership with her partner, Soren Lind, who does a lot of the writing, then she does a lot of the filmic work. But I think that in using virtual media, she's kind of evoking these, it's almost, there's some kitsch in a way of evoking this kind of like very classically futuristic model of, oh, we can recognize science fiction through these like vast CGI landscapes. But she's also using it as this model of, you can create anything. You can truly build anything through CGI and make it look so much like the world that we experience in this way that I think is super productive for her. But she does use sculpture, and her performance art of actually bearing the kufaya printed plates, I think, is super meaningful and impactful for her, and also for community. She worked in tandem with people to traverse this landscape and implant into the earth to sort of grow these new civilizations. So there are these multiple different modes that she engages in, all of which sort of hold different resonances, but they're all interesting, I think. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're not doing this by design, but as it happens, I think the last question again today is going to go to Professor Lindsay Kaplan.
Oh no, so much pressure. Well, my question draws on the last few as well, and it's for both of you, because I loved the pairing, because it's so clear that you're both making statements about the role of art in society and the importance of the imagination, but they're so different. Quinn, yours is all non-narrative, and Alexis, yours is so narrative. So I was wondering if you could kind of telescope out for a moment and maybe speak in ways I think you're already starting to, about why at that historical moment it figures in that media in that way. Especially, I'm particularly interested in now the resurgence of narrative and essay films and the about. It's like the politics is so present, whereas in Quinn it's so almost illegible. So I just thought if you could speak a little bit to the kind of historical reasons for the forms these imaginary worlds take, that would be great. Thanks.
I went first last time, Quinn. You want to go this time?
So yeah, that is an interesting question. I think that the difference between our two projects and the narrative component is very poignant. And I think for Kandinsky, he was just at the beginning of the century, he was very disillusioned with sort of the onset of capitalism in Western Europe, and there were a bunch of student protests in Russia at the time and a lot of political unrest. And so I think he was just overall like disillusioned with politics and how politics were enacted. So he really wanted to get away from that, and art was his way of doing that while also trying to bring about change. So for him, the fact he was very much actually like anti-narrative and anti-language, since he was doing abstraction, and I think that was because he so much wanted that change to come from within the individual and from nowhere else, and wanted I guess a narrative or community to emerge from there organically. And I think the way that narrative often functions is that it is a way of bringing people together that is not exactly imposed, but it's sort of preconceived, I guess. Whereas Kandinsky wanted the conception of like a social whole to come from singular individuals, and I think that is a lot of the reason why, like, the source of the problems in his work. But I think it's a very valuable and honest place from where an anti-narrative stance comes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's awesome, because I mean, and I appreciate the question, because Sansour works in such an entirely different mode in that way, rather than thinking of needing to like dissolve language, dissolve linguistics, dissolve structures in order to have freedom. Sansour is imagining sort of this like excess of building structures, and that through this sort of excessive building, we can sort of reach a collectivity where we are all interconnected, which is where it does tie to Quinn, because I think that this sense of being ultimately at sort of a more profound level of being tied to others, to the earth, to the world around you, is what Sansour is seeking as a way toward freedom. But instead, yeah, I mean, I think this is such an interesting historical moment where people feel the need to be very precise about their politics, that there's this sense of you have to very clearly articulate everything, or you won't be able to convey what you're hoping to say. But it's also interesting because there are, I mean, and I wish I could have gone into this in my presentation, there are ways where beyond narrative, she is tying just visually what she's saying to her plot or to her theme, in this way of, like, for example, for the daughter who is a clone, Aaliyah, there are these scenes, these split screen scenes where you see these like very alien abstracted images of DNA next to a face of the girl, and you don't know if the girl is the original girl or the replicated girl. And then you're seeing this DNA that's supposed to be so, I mean, literally the most human thing you could possibly imagine, or the most organic thing you can possibly imagine, and it's so alien and abstracted. But yeah, in general, this way of using narrative, of focusing on words as a way to word the world differently, as a way of building worlds through vocabulary, yeah, it seems really prescient for this time of saying, this is a time where we have to think about our vocabulary and recognize its limits, but then in doing so, create this excess of other vocabulary, of other words, in order to even create new worlds. Otherwise, we're stuck. But yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's really wonderful.
Many thanks to all of the people who've asked questions, and many thanks to both of our panelists for their wonderful answers, very thoughtful answers. And this brings to a close our formal program. But what we have decided to do is to leave open the Zoom meeting so that anyone who wants to can stick around and mingle for a few minutes. Feel free to turn on your videos, feel free to turn on your mics, and feel free to, first of all, join me in offering a round of real or virtual applause for all of our presenters across these 2 days. And And I am now going to retire from the scene and let you all chat amongst yourselves.
Congratulations, everyone.